What happens when the person who's supposed to love you most becomes your biggest obstacle? What do you do when someone looks you in the eye and tells you that you'll never amount to anything, that you don't belong? Today, I'm going to share with you a story that will shake you to your core, a story about a woman who turned the cruelest rejection into the sweetest victory. Hi there, beautiful souls. I'm Tina, and I'm so grateful you've decided to spend some time with me today. You know, over the years I've collected thousands of stories of pain, triumph, heartbreak, and incredible comebacks. But this one is special. It's about a woman named Rebecca Martinez who faced something that would have broken most of us, but instead she used it as fuel to build something extraordinary. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why sometimes the people who hurt us the most actually give us the greatest gift, the motivation to prove them wrong. So please grab your coffee, get comfortable, and don't you dare leave before hearing how this incredible woman turned rejection into the most satisfying revenge. And if this story touches your heart the way it touched mine, please show me some love with a like and consider subscribing, because trust me, you don't want to miss the stories I share here. Rebecca Martinez was 26 years old when she married David Chen, and from the very beginning, she knew that winning over his mother, Eleanor Chen, would be an uphill battle. Eleanor was a formidable woman in her 60s, with silver hair always perfectly styled and a wardrobe that screamed old money and social status. She lived in Willow Heights, the most exclusive neighborhood in town, where the houses were mansions and the property values started at $2 million. Eleanor had very specific ideas about who was worthy of her precious son, and Rebecca, a first-generation Mexican-American from the working-class side of town, definitely didn't fit her vision. The perfectly manicured lawns and towering oak trees of Willow Heights seemed to whisper secrets of generational wealth that Rebecca had never known, creating an invisible barrier between her world and Eleanor's pristine existence. The first time Rebecca walked into Eleanor's pristine white colonial mansion, she felt the weight of disapproval settle on her shoulders like a heavy coat. Eleanor's eyes swept over Rebecca's simple sundress and department store shoes with barely concealed disdain. "So you're the girl David's been telling me about," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "How interesting." The way she said interesting made it clear she meant anything but complimentary. During that first dinner, Eleanor peppered Rebecca with questions that felt more like an interrogation than friendly conversation. "Where did you go to college, dear?" "Oh, community college. How practical. And what do your parents do? Your father works in construction? How hardworking." Each response was met with a tight smile and a barely perceptible shake of the head, as if Eleanor was mentally checking off boxes labeled unsuitable. Despite the obvious hostility, Rebecca tried her best to win Eleanor over. She brought homemade tamales to family gatherings, only to watch Eleanor push them around her plate untouched. She offered to help with holiday preparations, only to be told that everything was already handled. "Thank you very much." She complimented Eleanor's garden, her home, her cooking, but nothing seemed to penetrate the wall of cold politeness that Eleanor had erected between them. David, caught in the middle, would always defend his mother with phrases like, "She just needs time to warm up to you," or, "You know how traditional she is." But Rebecca could see the truth in Eleanor's eyes. This wasn't about needing time. This was about Eleanor believing deep in her heart that Rebecca simply wasn't good enough for her son. The breaking point came during David and Rebecca's engagement party, held at Eleanor's house, naturally. Rebecca had spent weeks planning what she would wear, finally settling on a beautiful blue dress that David had helped her pick out. She thought she looked elegant and appropriate, but the moment she walked into the party, she felt Eleanor's disapproving gaze like a physical weight. Throughout the evening, Eleanor made subtle but cutting remarks. When guests complimented Rebecca's dress, Eleanor would smile tightly and say, "Yes, it's very colorful." When someone mentioned how lucky David was, Eleanor would respond, "Well, love is blind, isn't it?" But the worst moment came when Eleanor's friend, Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, asked Eleanor what she thought of her future daughter-in-law. Eleanor glanced around to make sure Rebecca was within earshot, then said in a voice just loud enough to be heard, "Oh, Patricia, you know how it is with these mixed marriages. The girl is trying her best, but honestly, she'll never really fit in with our crowd. Some people are just born to different circles, if you know what I mean." The words hit Rebecca like a slap across the face, each syllable burning into her memory with crystalline clarity. Her hands trembled as she set down her champagne glass, the sound of it hitting the marble table seeming unnaturally loud. The casual cruelty of it, the way Eleanor dismissed her entire worth as a person based on her background, left Rebecca speechless. She excused herself to the bathroom, where she stared at her reflection in the mirror and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to let Eleanor's prejudice define her. She wasn't going to shrink herself to make this woman comfortable. Instead, she was going to prove Eleanor wrong in the most spectacular way possible. That night, after the engagement party, Rebecca lay awake next to David, Eleanor's words echoing in her mind like a poison that refused to be forgotten. "She'll never really fit in with our crowd." The phrase played on repeat, each repetition making her more determined than defeated. David was fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his fiancée's heart, his gentle breathing a stark contrast to the racing thoughts keeping Rebecca wide-eyed in the darkness. She studied his peaceful face in the moonlight filtering through their bedroom window, wondering if he truly understood what his mother's words had done to her, or if he was simply choosing to ignore the toxicity for the sake of family harmony. Rebecca had always been a fighter. It's how she'd made it through college working 3 jobs. How she'd built a career in marketing despite coming from a family where no one had ever worked in an office. But this was different. This wasn't about proving herself to strangers or employers. This was about proving herself to the woman who would be her family, whether Eleanor liked it or not. As she lay there, Rebecca's mind began formulating a plan so audacious it made her pulse quicken with equal parts terror and excitement. The next morning, Rebecca started researching Willow Heights with the intensity of a detective working a case. She studied property values, looked at recent sales, researched the history of the neighborhood while David showered, her laptop screen illuminating her determined expression as she dove deeper into Eleanor's carefully constructed world. What she found was fascinating. Willow Heights wasn't just expensive, it was exclusive in the way that only old money neighborhoods could be. Most of the homes had been in the same families for generations, passed down like precious heirlooms. Very few properties ever came on the market, and when they did, they were usually sold through private networks before ever being listed publicly. The neighborhood was Eleanor's pride and joy, her symbol of status and belonging. It was her fortress, and she was the queen surveying her domain from her pristine colonial castle. Rebecca's jaw clenched as she scrolled through the neighborhood association's website, reading about their carefully maintained standards and preservation of community values, coded language that reeked of exclusivity and gatekeeping. Each perfectly manicured lawn photo and historical preservation notice felt like another barrier Eleanor had erected to keep people like Rebecca at arm's length. The coffee in her mug grew cold as she absorbed every detail, memorizing street layouts and architectural styles, understanding that knowledge would be her weapon in whatever battle was coming. But Rebecca discovered something else in her research, something that made her heart race with possibility. The house directly next to Eleanor's, a beautiful Victorian mansion that had been empty for 2 years, was quietly being prepared for sale. The owner, an elderly man named Harold Morrison, had moved to a retirement community, and his family was ready to let the property go. Rebecca learned that the asking price was $3.2 million, a staggering amount that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. But Rebecca had been saving aggressively since college, and she had something else working in her favor. She was brilliant with investments, having turned her modest savings into a substantial portfolio through careful stock picks and real estate investments. Her fingers trembled slightly as she calculated the numbers, her breath catching when she realized it was actually within reach. The irony wasn't lost on her. Eleanor had dismissed her as someone who would never belong, never understanding that Rebecca had quietly amassed more wealth than most people in their precious neighborhood would ever see. She closed her laptop with a soft click, her decision crystallizing like ice in her veins. If Eleanor wanted to play games about who belonged where, Rebecca was ready to change the rules entirely. She would show that judgmental woman exactly what happens when you underestimate someone who has spent their entire life proving people wrong. The process of buying the Morrison house was like conducting a secret military operation. Rebecca couldn't risk David finding out before she was ready to reveal her plan. She knew he would try to talk her out of it, worried about what his mother would think or say. So Rebecca became a master of compartmentalization, handling all the meetings with real estate agents, inspectors, and lawyers during her lunch breaks or after David left for his evening runs. She used her maiden name for all the paperwork and had everything sent to her office instead of their shared apartment. The level of secrecy required was exhausting, but Rebecca found herself energized by the mission. Every document signed, every inspection passed, every step closer to closing felt like a victory against Eleanor's belief that she didn't belong. Her heart would race during particularly close calls, like when David almost intercepted a call from her mortgage broker, or when she had to quickly close her laptop screen showing floor plans. The deception felt foreign to her naturally honest nature, but Eleanor's cruel words had awakened something fierce within her that demanded vindication. Each night, she lay awake rehearsing explanations she might give David, her pulse quickening as she imagined his bewildered expression when he discovered her elaborate secret. The Morrison house was even more beautiful than Rebecca had imagined from the online photos. Built in 1895, it was a stunning example of Victorian architecture with all the charm and character that Eleanor's more modern colonial lacked. The house had been lovingly maintained by the Morrison family for over a century, with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and intricate woodwork that spoke of an era when craftsmanship was an art form. Standing in the grand foyer during her first walkthrough, Rebecca could envision herself living there, hosting dinner parties, creating memories that would rival anything Eleanor had ever experienced in her perfectly manicured home next door. She ran her fingers along the carved banister, imagining Eleanor's shocked face peering through her living room window as Rebecca carried in boxes marked with her name. The thought made her lips curve into a satisfied smile that would have surprised even David with its sharpness. The afternoon light filtered through the diamond-paned windows, casting jeweled shadows across the polished floors, and Rebecca whispered to herself, "This is where I belong." The real estate agent, a sophisticated woman named Catherine Walsh, was initially skeptical when Rebecca expressed serious interest in the property. "This is quite an investment for someone so young," Catherine said, clearly trying to gauge whether Rebecca was a serious buyer or just someone curious about how the wealthy lived. But when Rebecca provided her pre-approval letter and financial documentation, Catherine's entire demeanor changed. "My goodness, Ms. Martinez, I apologize for any doubt. You're obviously a very successful young woman." The validation felt good, but Rebecca wasn't doing this for the approval of strangers. She was doing this to prove to herself and to Eleanor that belonging wasn't about bloodlines or old money. It was about having the courage to claim your space in the world. Rebecca found herself wondering if Catherine would mention the sale to other agents, if word might somehow filter back through the network of gossip that seemed to bind all the women in Willow Heights together like an invisible web. Catherine's impressed tone reminded Rebecca of how Eleanor's voice had dripped with condescension, the stark contrast fueling her determination even more. The inspection revealed that the Morrison house was in excellent condition, requiring only minor updates that Rebecca was more than prepared to handle. The property included not just the main house, but also a charming guest cottage, a 3-car garage, and gardens that rivaled Eleanor's prized landscape. Most importantly, the house sat on a slightly elevated lot that would give Rebecca a perfect view into Eleanor's backyard, a fact that made Rebecca smile with anticipation. She imagined Eleanor's face when she realized her new neighbor wasn't some other society matron, but the young woman she'd dismissed so cruelly. The elevation advantage felt symbolic somehow, as if the universe was positioning Rebecca to literally look down on the woman who had tried to make her feel small. During the inspection, Rebecca stood at the master bedroom window, gazing down at Eleanor's pristine garden where she held her exclusive tea parties, and felt a surge of vindictive pleasure at the thought of disrupting that carefully controlled world. As the closing date approached, Rebecca found herself walking through the house during the final inspection, imagining the conversation she would have with David when she finally revealed what she'd done. She practiced the words in her mind, trying to find the right way to explain that this wasn't about spite or revenge. It was about refusing to be diminished by someone else's narrow worldview. Standing in what would become her master bedroom, looking out the window toward Eleanor's house, Rebecca felt a sense of power and purpose she'd never experienced before. This house would be her statement to the world that she belonged wherever she chose to be, that no one else got to decide her worth or her place in society. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the Victorian windows, casting rainbow patterns across the hardwood floors through the stained glass accents. In that moment, Rebecca felt like she was standing in a cathedral of her own making, a sanctuary where Eleanor's poisonous words could never reach her again. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching Eleanor's silhouette move past a downstairs window, completely unaware of the storm about to arrive next door. The closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, deliberately chosen so that Rebecca would have the weekend to move in before anyone in the neighborhood realized what had happened. She arranged for professional movers, hired a cleaning service, and even contracted a landscaping company to ensure the property would look absolutely perfect from day one. Rebecca had learned from Eleanor that in neighborhoods like Willow Heights, appearances mattered enormously, and she was determined to make an impression that no one could criticize. Every detail was planned with military precision because Rebecca understood that she would be under scrutiny from the moment her presence was discovered. She needed to be absolutely perfect, beyond reproach, so that even Eleanor couldn't find fault with her as a neighbor. Her hands trembled slightly as she signed the final documents, knowing that with each signature, she was crossing a bridge she could never uncross, committing to a confrontation that would change everything between her, David, and Eleanor forever. Moving day arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed designed for new beginnings. Rebecca had arranged for the moving trucks to arrive early, hoping to get most of her belongings inside before the neighborhood was fully awake. But as she stood on the front steps of her new home, holding the keys that represented so much more than just property ownership, she realized that stealth was neither possible nor necessary. She was done hiding, done shrinking herself to make others comfortable. If the neighbors were going to notice her arrival, then she would make sure it was an arrival worth noticing. The crisp October air filled her lungs as she inhaled deeply, tasting the sweet victory that had been months in the making. Every leaf that rustled in the gentle breeze seemed to whisper encouragement, as if nature itself was celebrating her triumph. The house stood before her like a fortress of vindication, its Victorian architecture commanding respect from every angle. The moving crew was professional and efficient, carrying Rebecca's carefully chosen furniture into the Victorian mansion with the kind of respect reserved for truly valuable pieces. Rebecca had spent months selecting every item, choosing pieces that would honor the house's historic character while reflecting her own sophisticated taste. The antique dining room set she'd found at an estate sale would look perfect in the formal dining room. The vintage Persian rugs she'd bought at auction would complement the original hardwood floors beautifully. Every choice was deliberate, designed to create a home that would command respect from even the most critical observer. She directed the placement of each piece with quiet authority, her voice carrying across the yard as she instructed the movers to handle her grandmother's crystal chandelier with extra care. The ornate fixture had been passed down through 3 generations, and now it would grace the entryway of her new home like a crown jewel announcing her arrival. The crew leader, a weathered man who'd clearly moved his share of wealthy families, seemed genuinely impressed by the quality of her pieces. "Ma'am, you've got exquisite taste," he told her as they carefully maneuvered an enormous mahogany armoire through the front door. "This stuff belongs in a house like this." His words carried the weight of professional validation, confirming what Rebecca already knew. She belonged here as much as any blue-blooded family who had ever called this neighborhood home. Around 10 in the morning, Rebecca noticed movement in Eleanor's yard. She watched through her new living room window as Eleanor emerged from her house in her weekend gardening outfit, still perfectly coordinated, of course, and began tending to her prize-winning roses. It was the moment Rebecca had been both anticipating and dreading. She took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and walked outside to her front yard, making herself visible to her new neighbor. The morning sun caught the brass nameplate she'd already installed by her front door, Rebecca Chen Williams, engraved in elegant script. The reaction was everything Rebecca had hoped for and more. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to move with deliberate calm, each step across her new lawn, a small victory against every doubt Eleanor had ever planted in her mind. The dewy grass beneath her feet felt like a red carpet, and she couldn't suppress the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth as she watched Eleanor's world quietly implode. Eleanor looked up from her roses and did a complete double-take, her pruning shears frozen in mid-clip. For a moment, the older woman seemed to think she was hallucinating. She blinked several times, shook her head, and looked again. When the reality of what she was seeing finally sank in, Eleanor's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally, something that looked very much like panic. She dropped her pruning shears and walked slowly toward the property line, as if she needed to get closer to confirm that her eyes weren't deceiving her. "This can't be happening," Rebecca heard her mutter under her breath, and for the first time in years, Rebecca felt a surge of genuine satisfaction. The sound of Eleanor's disbelief was sweeter than any symphony. Validation that every sacrifice and sleepless night spent building her career had been worthwhile. "Rebecca!" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying the name too loudly might make the impossible situation real. What are you doing here?" Rebecca smiled with the kind of serene confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. "Good morning, Eleanor. I'm moving in. I bought the Morrison house. I guess that makes us neighbors now." The words were simple, but their impact was devastating. Eleanor gripped the fence between their properties as if she needed physical support to process what she was hearing. Rebecca savored the moment, watching years of condescension crumble in Eleanor's startled eyes. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had declared she would never fit in was now staring at undeniable proof that Rebecca fit in better than most. You bought this house? This house costs—" Eleanor couldn't even finish the sentence, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile her assumptions about Rebecca's financial situation with the reality of what she was witnessing. $3.2 million, Rebecca finished helpfully. "Yes, I know. It's a beautiful property, don't you think? I'm particularly excited about the garden. I understand you're quite the expert on roses. Perhaps you could give me some advice on caring for the heritage varieties that came with the property." Her tone was honey-sweet, each word carefully chosen to emphasize just how thoroughly Eleanor had underestimated her. The older woman's face had gone pale, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her shocked complexion. Rebecca felt a deep sense of poetic justice watching Eleanor struggle to process this reversal of fortune. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as neighborly small talk. Eleanor peppered Rebecca with barely concealed questions about financing, down payments, and mortgage terms, clearly trying to find some explanation that would preserve her worldview. Maybe Rebecca's parents had money they'd hidden? Maybe David had co-signed for everything? Maybe this was all some elaborate rental arrangement? But Rebecca answered each question with calm precision, making it clear that she had purchased the property entirely on her own, with her own money, earned through her own success. Each answer was another nail in the coffin of Eleanor's prejudices, another crack in the foundation of assumptions that had allowed her to dismiss Rebecca so easily. The woman who had once suggested Rebecca shop at discount stores was now learning that her future daughter-in-law was wealthy enough to buy properties in cash. As the reality of the situation settled in, Eleanor's shock began transforming into something else. A grudging recognition that she had severely miscalculated her future daughter-in-law's capabilities and resources. The young woman she had dismissed as never fitting in had just bought one of the most prestigious properties in the neighborhood. Rebecca could see the wheels turning in Eleanor's mind, trying to process how dramatically wrong she had been about everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of Eleanor's shattered assumptions and Rebecca's quiet triumph. For years, Eleanor had wielded her social position like a weapon, using it to make Rebecca feel small and unwelcome. Now, standing in the shadow of Rebecca's magnificent new home, Eleanor was discovering what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that dynamic. The weekend that followed was a delicate dance of establishing territory and setting boundaries. Rebecca threw herself into making the Morrison house not just livable, but spectacular. She hired interior designers, brought in additional furniture pieces, and even arranged for fresh flowers to be delivered and placed throughout the main rooms. Every window that faced Eleanor's house was dressed with elegant curtains that could be opened to provide perfect sight lines between the properties. Rebecca wanted to make sure that Eleanor would see glimpses of her new neighbor's life, whether she wanted to or not. The scent of expensive candles drifted through the rooms as she arranged imported orchids on marble surfaces, each detail chosen specifically to communicate a message of refined elegance that would be impossible to ignore. David's reaction, when he finally arrived Sunday evening after his weekend golf tournament, was everything Rebecca had hoped for. She watched from her new living room window as his car pulled into Eleanor's driveway for their usual Sunday dinner. She could imagine the conversation happening inside that house. Eleanor frantically trying to explain to her son that his fiancée had somehow managed to buy the house next door. David probably thinking his mother had finally lost her mind. Rebecca had turned off all her lights and waited, knowing that eventually curiosity would drive David to walk over and see for himself. The anticipation made her heart race as she positioned herself perfectly to observe his inevitable approach, her hands trembling slightly with nervous excitement. The knock on her front door came at exactly 8:30. Rebecca opened it to find David standing there, looking completely bewildered, holding a flashlight and squinting at the house numbers as if he might have made some mistake. "Rebecca? What the hell is going on? My mother says you bought this house, but that's impossible, right? Tell me that's impossible." His voice cracked slightly on the word impossible, and she could see the genuine confusion mixed with growing realization in his eyes. Rebecca stepped aside and gestured for him to come in, turning on the lights to reveal the fully furnished, beautifully decorated interior of what was now her home. The warm glow illuminated crystal fixtures and silk upholstery that seemed to mock his assumption about her financial limitations. Her pulse quickened as she watched his jaw drop, his preconceptions crumbling like ancient paper in her perfectly manicured hands. David walked through the rooms like a man in a trance, touching furniture and walls as if he needed physical confirmation that what he was seeing was real. "How is this possible? How did you? Rebecca, this house costs millions of dollars. We don't have millions of dollars." His voice grew smaller with each question, and she could see him mentally calculating everything he thought he knew about their relationship. Rebecca poured him a glass of wine and sat him down in what was now her living room. "Actually, I do have millions of dollars, David. I've been very successful, more successful than I think anyone realized. And when your mother made it clear that I would never fit in with your family's social circle, I decided to demonstrate just how wrong she was." She watched as the words sank in, his face cycling through disbelief, embarrassment, and something that might have been pride. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight and covered everything from Rebecca's investment strategies to her long-term financial planning. David learned about business deals he'd never heard of, investment returns that had compounded beyond his imagination, and the inheritance from Rebecca's grandmother that had been far more substantial than she'd ever mentioned. Most importantly, he began to understand that his fiancée wasn't just successful, she was wealthy, sophisticated, and far more capable than he had ever given her credit for. The revelation hit him like cold water as he realized how many assumptions he had made about the woman he claimed to love. But the most difficult part of the conversation wasn't about money or real estate. It was about respect, dignity, and what it meant to stand up for yourself when someone tries to make you feel small. Rebecca explained to David how his mother's comments had affected her, how the constant subtle put-downs and dismissive remarks had made her feel unwelcome in her own relationship. She talked about the engagement party, about overhearing Eleanor's cruel assessment of their relationship, and about the decision she had made to prove that she belonged wherever she chose to be. Her voice remained steady even as tears threatened, because this conversation was too important for weakness. "My beautiful friends, I have to pause here again, because this story is touching something deep in my heart, and I hope it's touching yours too. Have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who should have seen it from the beginning? Have you ever had to fight for respect that should have been freely given?" Rebecca's courage in that moment. Buying that house wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about refusing to let someone else's limitations become her reality. If this story is inspiring you, If it's making you think about times when you've had to fight for your own dignity, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories inspire me just as much as I hope these stories inspire you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider joining our community of people who believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Hit that subscribe button and let's continue this journey together. Because trust me, Rebecca's story is far from over, and the ending will absolutely blow your mind. The transformation of the neighborhood dynamic was swift and dramatic. Within days of Rebecca's arrival, word had spread throughout Willow Heights that Eleanor Chen's future daughter-in-law had purchased the Morrison property. The news traveled through the community like wildfire, generating the kind of gossip and speculation that usually accompanied major scandals or unexpected windfalls. At the weekly ladies' luncheon at the country club, Eleanor found herself on the receiving end of questions she had no idea how to answer, her carefully constructed social armor suddenly feeling paper-thin against the probing gazes of women who had once deferred to her judgment. "Eleanor, dear, you must be so pleased to have Rebecca as a neighbor now," said Patricia Whitmore, the same woman who had witnessed Eleanor's cruel assessment of Rebecca at the engagement party. "It's wonderful when young people are so successful, isn't it? You must be proud of David for choosing someone with such impressive business acumen." The words were polite, but Patricia's tone carried an undercurrent of amusement that made Eleanor's cheeks burn with embarrassment. Everyone in their social circle now knew that Eleanor had dramatically misjudged her future daughter-in-law's capabilities and social standing. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, the delicate china suddenly feeling heavier than usual. "Yes, well," she managed to stammer, her usual composure cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. Rebecca certainly surprised us all. The admission tasted bitter in her mouth, each syllable a reluctant acknowledgement of her own spectacular miscalculation. Rebecca, meanwhile, was settling into her new role as a Willow Heights homeowner with grace and strategic brilliance. She joined the neighborhood association, volunteered for the annual garden tour, and made generous donations to the local historical society. When the community newsletter needed a new sponsor for their monthly publication, Rebecca stepped forward with a check that was larger than they had received from any previous sponsor. Every action was calculated to demonstrate not just her financial resources, but her commitment to being a positive contributor to the community that Eleanor had insisted she would never fit into. Her morning runs through the pristine streets became a daily reminder to the neighbors of her presence, her confident stride and warm greetings to fellow residents, gradually melting away any remaining skepticism about the newcomer who had so dramatically altered the social landscape of their exclusive enclave. The psychological impact on Eleanor was profound and visible. The woman who had once carried herself with the confidence of someone who controlled her social environment now seemed uncertain and off balance. Rebecca would often notice Eleanor watching her from her windows, as if she were studying a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The perfectly manicured garden that had once been Eleanor's pride and joy suddenly seemed less impressive when viewed next to Rebecca's expertly landscaped grounds. The dinner parties that Eleanor hosted seemed smaller and less significant when Rebecca's elegant gatherings were happening right next door. Each morning, Eleanor would wake to the sound of Rebecca's landscaping crew arriving at dawn. Their efficient work, a stark reminder of how effortlessly her neighbor commanded resources that Eleanor herself struggled to manage on her fixed retirement income. David found himself caught between two worlds that were suddenly more complex than he had ever imagined. His mother, who had always been his source of social guidance and family wisdom, was clearly struggling with a situation she had never anticipated. His fiancée, whom he was realizing he had never fully understood or appreciated, was demonstrating capabilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about their relationship. The comfortable dynamic where Eleanor was the sophisticated matriarch and Rebecca was the outsider trying to fit in had been completely shattered, replaced by a new reality where Rebecca held more social and financial power than anyone had realized. The breaking point came during the annual Willow Heights charity auction, an event that Eleanor had chaired for the past 15 years and considered her signature social achievement. The auction raised funds for the local children's hospital, and Eleanor prided herself on securing the most prestigious donations and organizing the most elegant evening of the year. This year, however, Rebecca had quietly arranged for her marketing company to sponsor the event, providing professional event planning services and securing donations from her extensive network of business contacts that far exceeded anything the auction had ever received. When the final numbers were tallied, the auction had raised nearly double its previous record, largely due to Rebecca's behind-the-scenes contributions. The hospital administrators were effusive in their praise for Rebecca's involvement, and the local newspaper featured her prominently in their coverage of the event. Eleanor, who had expected to be celebrated for another successful auction, instead found herself overshadowed by the very woman she had dismissed as unsuitable for her family. The role reversal was complete and undeniable. Rebecca had not only proven she belonged in Eleanor's world, she had demonstrated that she could excel in it beyond Eleanor's own achievements. Standing in her new home after the auction, looking out at Eleanor's house through her living room window, Rebecca felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had achieved everything she had set out to prove, but the victory felt bittersweet. This had never really been about showing off or seeking revenge. It had been about demanding the respect and dignity that should have been offered freely from the beginning. She had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of her life to prove a point that shouldn't have needed proving. That a person's worth isn't determined by their family background or social connections, but by their character, capabilities, and contributions to their community. The final chapter of Rebecca's story unfolded during what should have been one of the happiest times of her life, the month leading up to her wedding to David. Instead of focusing on flower arrangements and venue details, Rebecca found herself navigating the complex new dynamic she had created between herself and Eleanor. The older woman had become almost submissive in her interactions with Rebecca, a dramatic change from the dismissive condescension that had characterized their previous relationship. Eleanor now asked Rebecca's opinion on everything from garden design to charity event planning, as if seeking approval from someone whose judgment she had learned to respect, even if grudgingly. The shift was so pronounced that other neighbors began to notice, whispering about how Mrs. Whitman seemed to defer to the young woman she had once dismissed so publicly. Rebecca watched Eleanor's transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and uncomfortable pity, recognizing that the power dynamic between them had shifted so completely that it left them both uncertain about how to interact naturally. The morning coffee ritual Eleanor had once used to exclude Rebecca now became awkward encounters where Eleanor would hover near her fence, desperate for acknowledgement from the woman she had so thoroughly underestimated. But David was struggling with the changes in his family dynamic. During one of their final wedding planning meetings, he confessed to Rebecca that he felt like he didn't know either of the most important women in his life anymore. "My mother acts like she's afraid of you now," he said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "And I'm realizing I never really knew who you were to begin with. How did I miss so much? How did I not understand how successful you were? How capable you were? What else don't I know about you?" His questions weren't accusatory, but they revealed a fundamental problem in their relationship. David had fallen in love with his idea of who Rebecca was, not with who she actually was. The vulnerability in his voice made Rebecca's heart ache because she could see that he was genuinely bewildered by the woman she had revealed herself to be. Rebecca realized that buying the house next to Eleanor's had solved one problem, but revealed another. She had proven that she belonged in Eleanor's social world, but in doing so, she had exposed the fact that David had never truly seen or appreciated her full potential. He loved the version of Rebecca who needed his guidance and support, who looked to him for direction and validation. The Rebecca who could buy million-dollar properties and command respect from society matrons was intimidating to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The wedding took place as planned, but it was a different celebration than either Rebecca or David had originally envisioned. Eleanor played her role as mother of the groom with a new awareness of her daughter-in-law's capabilities and social standing. The guest list had expanded significantly to include Rebecca's business associates and the new social connections she had made in Willow Heights. What should have been Eleanor's carefully controlled family celebration had become Rebecca's coming-out party as a member of the community's social elite. During the reception, held in the garden of Rebecca's new home, Eleanor approached her new daughter-in-law for a private conversation. Standing among the heritage roses that Rebecca had carefully cultivated, Eleanor offered what amounted to a formal apology. "I was wrong about you, Rebecca. I was wrong about everything. You've shown me that my assumptions were not only incorrect but harmful, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." The words were genuine, but they came too late to undo the damage that had been done to their relationship. Rebecca accepted the apology with grace, but both women understood that their relationship would forever be shaped by Eleanor's initial rejection and Rebecca's dramatic response to it. In the months that followed the wedding, Rebecca continued to thrive in her new role as a Willow Heights resident and community leader. She expanded her marketing business, taking on high-profile clients and building a reputation that extended far beyond the neighborhood's borders. Her success became a source of pride for the community, proof that their exclusive enclave could attract and nurture exceptional talent. Eleanor, meanwhile, had to reconcile herself to the reality that her daughter-in-law was not only an equal member of their social circle, but potentially a more influential one. The house next to Eleanor's became more than just Rebecca's home. It became a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to accept other people's limitations. Young women in the community would point to Rebecca's story as proof that background didn't determine destiny, that respect could be demanded and earned, and that sometimes the best response to rejection was remarkable success. Rebecca had transformed Eleanor's cruel prediction that she would never fit in into a powerful motivation that ultimately elevated her far beyond simply fitting in. She had become a leader, a role model, and a reminder that underestimating someone based on their background is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. Looking back on her journey from that devastating engagement party to her current position as one of Willow Heights' most respected residents, Rebecca understood that Eleanor had actually given her a gift, though certainly not an intentionally generous one. The rejection had forced Rebecca to prove her worth not just to Eleanor, but to herself. The house next door had become the foundation for a life that exceeded every expectation and limitation that had ever been placed on her. Proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be diminished by someone else's narrow vision of who you're supposed to be.